Ooh, okay.
Right.
Okay, this is the Haitian Revolution.
Should we mute ourselves?
If you want.
Yeah, probably.
Okay, yeah.
Okay. So people know little or don't know anything about the Haitian Revolution. And yeah, in its own way, it was as important as the other better known revolutions in the same century, the American and French. It was the only successful slave revolt in modern history and established the first independent Black Republic. However, the Haitian Revolution was pretty complex, consisting of several revolts going on simultaneously. And because it was a French colony, it was influenced by and also influenced by the French Revolution that was happening at the same time. This is going to be like an overview of the whole thing. If you want to go into it more, there is a podcast on the Revolutions podcast, but it stretches to 19 episodes and it's over 10 hours, the whole 19 episodes. So this is going to be just over half an hour, so there's going to be lots left out. Right. So it begins in 1492 when Columbus sailed, well, you know the rest. He landed on an island known to its inhabitants as Haiti, A-Y-T-I, but called it Hispaniola, because that's what they did. From then on, it was the usual story of enslaving the indigenous population and searching for gold and other precious materials. The French colonized the west of the island, and the Spanish officially ceded it to them in 1697. By this time, the Spanish referred to it as Santo Domingo, and the French called their side Saint Dominique. By the 18th century, Saint Dominique had become France's wealthiest overseas colony, largely because of its production of sugar, coffee, and indigo, and the wealth generated by an enslaved African labor force. Absent white French planters enriched themselves and left hired managers to run their properties. The main interest of these managers was to accumulate as much money as possible for themselves in the hopes of either buying their own plantations or returning to France. And because of this, they treated the slaves fairly harshly, well, very harshly, and skimmed money off that should have been spent on their care. From the point of view of the authorities in mainland France, that's called the Metropole at this time, Saint Dominique existed in order to enrich the mother country and help France compete with the other European colonial powers. The French had imposed the exclusive. This was similar to the British mercantile system and required the colonists to buy their supplies only from French merchants and sell their products only in the mother country, in France. Colonists complained that the French merchant houses overcharged them for products shipped from Europe and underpaid them for their sugar, coffee, and indigo. The colonists reacted to this by carrying on a lively smuggling trade with other Caribbean islands and the British North American colonies. So the population, anyone born on Saint Dominique was known as a Creole, and there were several distinct groups in the colony. First, they were the white planters. They were called the Grand Blanc, literally the big whites, and they owned most of the plantations and slaves. The Petit Blanc, the small whites, were the artisans, shopkeepers, and teachers, etc. And together they numbered about 40,000. The three remaining groups were of African descent. There was no stigma unlike in North America, there was no stigma attached to interracial marriages or sex. The free coloreds, or affranchi, were the children born usually of a white father and a black mother, because most of the whites who went to the island were male. They could in turn marry another affranchi, a white man or a black slave, and there was about 30,000 free, what they call free black coloreds in 1789. They also sometimes owned slaves and were generally wealthier than the petit blancs. The black slave population was over 500,000. Such was the barbarity of the slave system developed by the French that the average life expectancy for the enslaved Africans was between 7 and 10 years. The enslaved population, therefore, had to be constantly replenished by around 30,000 new African slaves each year, and consequently, it was about 70% African born. Runaway slaves were called Maroons. The Maroons had retreated into the mountains of Saint-Dominique and formed close-knit communities that practiced small-scale agriculture and hunting, as well as trading with the Spanish in Santo Domingo. They were known to return to plantations to free family members and friends, and sometimes to steal goods to trade. We come to the Code Noir. The Code Noir supposedly served as a basis of the law of slavery in Saint-Dominique, while sanctioning a rigorous punitive scheme for the discipline of slave labor. The Code Noir prohibited the torture and mutilation of slaves and legalized manumission, or the freeing of slaves. This was important because if a white planter took a black slave as his wife, she was automatically then became freed, and the children did. It also granted any freed person, black or colored, free colored or white, the same rights and privileges. So everybody enjoyed the same rights and privileges once they were freed. Despite this, the white population, which was outnumbered about 10 to 1, feared a slave revolt, and so actually the black slaves were kept in constant terror to keep them cowed, and mutilation and torture were commonplace. The whites considered the slaves to be lazy and stupid, and this mainly came from the slaves' only form of passive resistance. They would pretend not to understand instructions and work at the slowest pace possible, which you would really if you've been whipped and stuff. And we come to voodoo. All the African slaves came from different tribal and geographical backgrounds, and gradually voodoo emerged as a composite of various African ethnic traditions. Roman Catholic iconography and rituals were adapted so as to conceal the true identity of the deities that the enslaved Africans were serving. This resulted in a religion that combined African spirits and beliefs with Roman Catholic saints. It was a common point of reference between the slaves. Those newly arrived from Africa could quickly recognize familiar deities and rituals in the voodoo ceremonies. Although officially illegal, slave owners saw the rituals as a safety valve against revolt. Right, the Metropole, the mainland France, feared that the white and free-colored Creole population could one day join together in common interests and break away from the Metropole. In order to prevent this, the exclusive was eased somewhat, and new laws on race were introduced. Statutes forbade free coloreds from taking up certain professions, marrying whites, wearing European clothing, carrying swords or firearms in public, or attending social functions where whites were present. The regulations did not restrict their purchase of land, however, and many were still able to accumulate substantial holdings. A complex system of race identification was drawn up based on a theory of skin colour. Everyone was classified according to their ancestry. It started off with mulatto, a child of one black and one white parent, then a quadroon, which had 3 white grandparents and 1 black grandparent. This went all the way down to 1 128th part black. So everybody was somewhere on this list, which obviously it caused much resentment amongst the free coloured population, as overnight they were classified as inferior to the whites. Then, as the news of revolution in France spread, tensions on the island increased. Both the white plantation owners and the free coloured had representatives in France arguing their respective cases. The Declaration of the Rights of Man and the Citizen was adopted in August 1789 by the French National Constituent Assembly and was taken by the free coloureds as a statement of their equality. Now, on the 8th of March 1790, the National Assembly voted to allow the colonial whites to determine the colony's political life without the free coloureds. And Vincent Auguet, a French Creole aristocrat of mixed descent, he was actually classed as a quadroon, was in Paris when the French Revolution broke out. He then returned to Saint-Dominique and instigated a rebellion against the white colonial authority. And that lasted from October to December 1790. He was eventually captured and executed. The National Assembly in France then passed the May 15 decree that gave all free men of colour with 2 free parents full rights and sent a 3-member civil commission to Saint-Dominique to oversee the implementation of the law. This resulted in the whites declaring independence to maintain their privileged position. Free coloureds denied admission to the white-only assembly on the island also took up arms in revolt. Shortly before it dissolved, the National Assembly reversed itself and voted to leave the fate of the rights of free coloured persons entirely in the hands of the white colonists again. When the members of the first civil commission arrived, they found that the main purpose of their mission had been overturned. Then, on the 22nd of August 1791, a massive slave insurrection began in the North Province. The slaves, contrary to the belief of the whites, were not stupid and lazy, but they were well aware of the events in France and decided it was time to act. On the 21st of August, after thousands of slaves attended a secret voodoo ceremony, the signal to begin the revolt was given by a high priest of voodoo and leader of the marooned slaves, Dutty Buckman, and Cecile Fatiman, a mambo, or a voodoo priestess. Moving rapidly from plantation to plantation in the flatlands of the Northern Plain, the first bands of insurgents gathered increasing numbers of supporters. Within a few days, almost the whole of the plain, the richest sugar-growing area in the colony, had been devastated, as hundreds of the smaller coffee plantations on the mountains bordering it were also devastated. Within the next 10 days, slaves had taken control of the entire northern province. The fighting was vicious and no prisoners were taken. Georges Biassou and Jean-Francois Papillon emerged as the most important insurgent leaders, along with their lieutenant called Jeannot. All 3 had been born slaves and extracted a terrible revenge. Jeannot was especially brutal, and in the end, he was actually executed on the order of Jean-Francois for murdering his own black soldiers. Biassou and Papillon proposed peace negotiations with France, offering to cease the revolt in exchange for emancipation. But at the same time, they were receiving supplies and support from the Spanish authorities in Santo Domingo. The shock of the uprising saw black slaves who were suspected of sympathy for the uprising being massacred in Cap Francais, which was the main city of the island, and on the plantations. Convinced that the slaves themselves could not have conceived such an elaborate plan, many whites blamed the free coloreds, and that resulted in some of them also being killed. The royal governor was besieged from all sides. Firstly, the whites who demanded protection for their rural properties, and then by those in Cap Francais who protested that he would leave them vulnerable if he sent troops into the countryside. When troops were finally sent against the slaves, they were actually baffled by the tactics used against them. They didn't use the same European ways of warfare. They used African methods of fighting. They always attacked from cover. They split into small bands to strike at vulnerable troops. They retreated whenever threatened, which the white troops mistakenly took as cowardice. And then they quickly struck back. A different kind of insurrection then occurred amongst the free coloreds in San Domingo's West Province, where they were in the majority. Many of them were slave owners in their own right, and so they were not seeking an end to this slavery or destruction of the plantation system. The free coloreds did recruit some black slaves to fight for them, but they kept control over the movement and did not let it turn into a general assault on the plantation system. Some of the white plantation owners recognized that they actually had more in common with their fellow free colored plantation owners than they first thought, in spite of the racial divide. So concordats were signed, and the whites had to agree to the replacement of the all-white local governments in the districts with new institutions with members of both racial groups represented. Then into all this confusion came a second commission sent by the French National Assembly, and it was headed by Etienne Polverol and Liger Sontana. I couldn't find any portrait of Polverol, so there's Sontana. Their official orders were to defeat the black insurrection, but both had previously denounced slavery and they had little sympathy for the big whites. Soon after they arrived, they learned that the shaky French constitutional monarchy that had appointed them had been overthrown and France was now a republic. The commissioners dissolved the all-white assembly and instituted a new assembly with equal representation of whites and free coloreds, with the majority of this assembly still occupied by supporters of slavery. The slave leaders saw no hope of emancipation, so they proclaimed their loyalty to the king, who had been deposed, who they thought would offer the best chance of freedom. The whites then staged an uprising in Cap Francais, positioning themselves as supporters of the Republic and condemning the slaves as counter-revolutionaries. Sontana and Poverol made an alliance with the free coloreds to subdue the whites and also to try and deal with the slave insurgents. So things are already in a bit of a confusing mess. Then in February 1793, into all this, Britain and Spain declared war on France. And so Saint-Domingue now faced outside threats. The white colonists made a secret treaty with the British to assist them in taking over the colony in return for the promise that slavery would be maintained. In response to the threat of invasion, the commissioners dropped their military campaign against the blacks and focused instead on suppressing the white slave owners. They tried to win the slave population over with modest concessions, issuing a decree reinstating all the provisions of the Code Noir and insisting that they would now be stringently enforced. But this was too little too late for the slave leaders, who had already made an alliance with the Spanish, who were offering freedom for anyone who fought under the Spanish flag. In May 1793, a new governor, General Galbard, arrived. The commissioners who were in the south of the country contacted him and ordered him not to take any actions until they could return to Cap Francais and discuss the situation with him. Galbard, however, owned slave plantations on the island and promptly alienated the free coloured population by making alliances with the whites and also with disgruntled sailors who were stuck on the ships in the harbour because it was being blockaded by the British. When Sontenac and Pomerol returned to Cap Francais, they eventually forced Galbard to agree to be sent back to France. The sailors then persuaded him, he was a fairly weak-minded man for all accounts, to lead an assault on the city to seize the commissioners. So Sontenac and Pomerol were defended by the armed free coloureds, who resisted the sailors. Nevertheless, Galbard's forces took over the city's arsenal, which meant they had hold of all the cannons and arms. So the commissioners and their free coloured supporters realised that they risked being overwhelmed and therefore decided to leave the city to make contact with the insurgent black groups, promising freedom for anyone recruited into their army. When the sailors and white population heard this, rumours started to circulate of a large black army descending on the city. Homes were abandoned and the white population fled to the harbour and started to scramble on board the ships. When the newly recruited black soldiers did enter, they found chaotic scenes with looting and fires out of control. And that's a picture of Cap Francais burning. The overcrowded ships then set sail, leaving Cap in the hands of the commissioners and their new black army. Out in the countryside, however, the other black insurgent armies, led by Biassou, Jean-Francois, and Toussaint Louverture, who had emerged as one of the leaders, did not break their alliance with the Spanish, as they were convinced it was only a matter of time before the French Republic was defeated in Europe by Britain, Spain, and other countries. The French commissioners then extended their emancipation to include the wives and children of any black soldier. But by the end of August 1793, Sontenac realised that nothing short of a general proclamation of emancipation would give him any chance of winning support from the blacks in the North Province. On the 29th of August, he announced that the principles of the French Declaration of the Rights of Man would now be applied in Saint-Domingue, and that the slaves were now free. But he did put limitations that they remain on the plantation as paid labourers. Then, in another turn of events, the National Convention in Paris went even further and decreed slavery abolished in all French colonies. All men without distinction of colour were now full French citizens, enjoying all the rights guaranteed by the Constitution. So the slaves started to leave the plantations. The Spanish allied black armies continued to control large areas, and the British had invaded some of the coastal areas. So here, emancipation did not apply. The free coloureds generally backed the British, although they were soon disappointed when they were not being given the same privileges as the remaining whites. British soldiers, like all European soldiers, were being decimated by disease and yellow fever. And that resulted in the British having also to try and raise an army of black troops in return for promising them their freedom. Toussaint Louverture, who had emerged as the most effective of the black leaders, then changed allegiance from the Spanish to support the French. He had recruited an outstanding cohort of officers from the ranks of the insurgents, commanders like Jean-Jacques Dessalines, Mosey, and Henry Christophe. He was placed under the command of General Lavaux, who had been appointed the new governor. Toussaint proved himself to be a skilled general and negotiator, and he understood the realities of war and politics. He knew how to win the loyalty of subordinates, and yet was quick to react to anything that seemed to undermine his authority. He was skilled at assessing the motives of others while keeping his own concealed. And Toussaint outwitted a long succession of rivals and opponents. In the south of the island, another powerful leader emerged, the free-coloured general André Rigaud. Rigaud's territory was the only part of Saint-Domingue that continued to function economically, and the French hoped to use its resources to fund the defence of the rest of the colony. Rigaud also offered freedom to black slaves who joined what he called the Legion of the South, and the majority of his troops were actually black. The officers commanding them, however, were light-skinned men of mixed race like he was. And even as he claimed to accept the abolition of slavery and equality of the races, Rigaud rigorously enforced the regulations imposed by Poverel to keep the blacks working on the plantations. While Toussaint Louverture and André Rigaud held off the British in Europe, the Spanish then made peace with the French and agreed to cede its colony of Santo Domingo to them. Jean-Francois and Bissou, Toussaint Louverture's main rivals amongst the leaders of the black insurrection, departed from the island along with their Spanish allies. This left Toussaint Louverture as the only major figure who could claim to have earned his position by his participation in the uprising that had begun in 1791, and the only black man amongst the military leaders of the French forces. Sonthonac and Poverel had been recalled to France to face a tribunal, but it vindicated their actions, and then Sonthonac was then assigned to a five-man third commission to oversee the island. They were accompanied by 1,200 troops under the command of General de Rochambeau, and there was plenty of arms for the black troops who now constituted the bulk of the French army. Before the commission arrived, Toussaint Louverture managed to put down an attempted coup by a free-coloured general called Jean-Louis Villat, further enhancing his position and his reputation. The British finally withdrew from the island in 1798, and the colony's black population attempted to shape a new society for themselves. In France, the rise of Napoleon Bonaparte saw yet another French representative sent to the island with orders to rein in Louverture's power. This proved to be an impossible task, but the French representative, while being there, also managed to worsen the already strained relations between Louverture and Rigaud, the leader of the Army of the South. Open warfare broke out in June 1799. The conflict was known as the War of the Knives and was fought again with great brutality on both sides. But Rigaud proved no match for Toussaint. With relentless determination, the black general drove his forces to conquer his rival's strongholds. But he was careful not to make the conflict into a straightforward race war, and he had many mixed race officers continuing to serve in his forces. So once in control of Saint-Domingue, Toussaint Louverture began to enact his own vision of a new society. From the beginning, he had constantly advocated a society in which blacks, whites, and people of mixed race would coexist on a basis of equality. The promise of racial equality meant that the free colours of whites remaining in Saint-Domingue retained all their rights, and many of them occupied official positions in Louverture's government. Although he insisted that freedom and equality were fundamentally basis of his new society, in his view, freedom did not give people the right to be idle or even to decide for themselves what kind of occupation to pursue. He was also determined, officially at least, to impose a strict code of morality on Saint-Domingue. For example, he banned divorce, which the French government had officially legalized in 1792. At the center of Toussaint Louverture's new society was the general himself. He clearly regarded his continued rule as the only guarantee that the revolutionary changes carried out since 1791 would last. At the beginning of January 1801, Toussaint Louverture dispatched an army of 20,000 men to take Santo Domingo. The Spanish had left a small force behind and nobody had bothered to occupy that part of the island. And he easily defeated this force. He then extended his laws to the former Spanish territory, proclaiming the freedom of 25,000 slaves. He then appointed a committee consisting of white property owners and a few men of mixed race to draft the constitutional document, and that would to incorporate his own ideas about how the colony would be governed. Much of the Louverturian constitution followed the pattern of various constitutional documents produced in France after the Revolution, but it had some unique features. It specified the irreversible abolition of slavery in Saint-Domingue, a guarantee that applied not only to those born in the colony, but anyone who lived there. This provision was meant as a response to the argument of some whites who claimed that the majority of the blacks in the colony were not entitled to the rights of Frenchmen since they had been born in Africa. These actions taken by Louverture angered the new French leader, Napoleon Bonaparte. He'd taken over from the Directory around the same time, and he saw it as a direct challenge to his authority. Several events then weakened Toussaint Louverture's position. Relations between France and the United States had improved, and the new president was a slave owner, Thomas Jefferson. And Bonaparte actually at this time sold what's called the Louisiana Purchase. To raise money, he sold a large chunk of land to the United States. Britain and France then signed a peace treaty, and that allowed the French to transport men and supplies to their colonies. In October 1801, blacks in the plantations in the North Province then revolted against a strict discipline being imposed on them by Toussaint Louverture, and killing several hundred whites. Toussaint ordered Dessalines, considered the harshest of his commanders, to crush the rebellion in the countryside. He blamed the military commander of the North Province, Mose, who was his adopted nephew, for allowing the movement to spread. And when Toussaint criticized him for not enforcing the labor regulations with sufficient rigor, Mose responded that he was unwilling to be the executioner of my color. Mose was then executed after a hasty trial. A 20,000 strong, heavily armed French army invaded in February 1802 and began to push the armies of Toussaint Louverture back. This was the most violent period of the Haitian Revolution, which was already very, very violent. The armies of both sides massacred civilians, enemy prisoners, and those they regarded as potential traitors in their own ranks. As the fighting intensified, any prospect for the maintenance of a society in which members of the island's three racial groups lived together on a base of equality disappeared. It was then seen that independence was the only way to defend emancipation. But one by one, Toussaint's generals, seeing his cause was hopeless, went over to the French, accepting the General Leclerc's assurances that they would be allowed to retain their rank and continue to command their men. Dessalines was the last of Toussaint's major field commanders to accept. This left Toussaint isolated, with few troops left willing to keep up the fight. Toussaint then announced that he was prepared to recognize Leclerc's authority. Leclerc promised him that he could retire peacefully to his plantation, and that his soldiers and officers would be integrated into the French army. But Leclerc always intended to get rid of Lubator. A month after his surrender, he was hustled on board a ship to be sent to France. His family was arrested next day and deported with him. Once in France, he was separated from his family and kept in solitary confinement in a prison hundreds of miles inland in the mountains. The cold, damp climate of his prison and the isolation in which he was kept soon undermined his health, and he died on the 7th of April, 1803. Back in Saint-Dominique, yellow fever had begun to ravage the French troops, as it had done all European troops, and Leclerc became more and more dependent on his black troops and officers. Napoleon then authorized the maintenance of slavery in the colonies. He reversed the decision of the earlier French assemblies. At first, it was just in places like Martinique where they had never actually been abolished. Convinced that the French meant to follow the same policy in Saint-Dominique, leading black and mixed-race officers in Leclerc's army, including Christophe and Dessalines, began to turn against the French, and the black troops in the army simply melted away into the mountains to join an uprising. Leclerc then came down with a deadly yellow fever, and he died as well. So the command of the French forces passed on to his second command, General Rochambeau, who was a very vicious and anti-black person. The insurrection against the French became better organized under the new leadership of Dessalines. Dessalines lacked Toussaint Louverture's subtlety and diplomatic skills, but he was singularly mindedly devoted to defeating the French, and he saw no need for a continued white presence in the country. Recognizing the importance of unity between the blacks and the mixed race population, Dessalines reconciled himself with the mixed race generals he had fought against during the War of the Knives. And for the first time since the start of the Haitian Revolution, the black and mixed race movements were finally united. Their goal was now to drive the French out of Saint-Dominique and make it an independent country. The last French hopes of retaining the colony disappeared in the spring of 1803 with the renewal of the war with Britain. An independence declaration was issued on the 29th of November 1803, signed by the three leading generals, Dessalines, Christophe, and Clairvaux, vowing never to tolerate the return of slavery. A subsequent document, dated the 1st of January 1804, was issued in the name of Dessalines alone, proclaimed a more radical break with the past. Dessalines announced that the country would now be called Haiti, the old Taino Indian name for the island, and in doing so, he was identifying the new nation with the island's original inhabitants, and symbolically rejecting not only Napoleonic France, but the entire legacy of European colonization. In February and March 1804, he personally supervised the massacre of the remaining white men in the colony, compelling the free colours to take part. Women and children were initially spared, but Dessalines eventually decided that they too needed to be eliminated. Many of his black soldiers balked at this order, but by the end of April, the white population had been virtually wiped out. Only a few doctors and other professionals were spared, along with a small number of Polish soldiers who had come to Saint-Dominique with Napoleon's expedition, but had then deserted and joined the Black Army. Dessalines then learned that Napoleon was about to declare himself French emperor and decided that he, as the ruler of Haiti, he would have the same rank. In May 1805, a new written constitution declared him emperor. It also emphasized that slavery was abolished forever and that all citizens, regardless of skin color, were to have equal rights. This made Haiti the first country in the world to make the abolition of slavery and of racial equality into a constitutional principle. To forestall any future return of the whites, the constitution also prohibited them from acquiring property in the country. The 1805 Constitution took a strong stand against slavery and racial hierarchy, but it had few protections against arbitrary rule by the government. Dessalines had warned the population that if ever you refused or grumbled while receiving these laws, that the spirit guarding your fate dictates to me for your own good, you would deserve the fate of an ungrateful people. Dessalines' constitution didn't have all the moralistic tone of Toussaint Louverture's, but it did go further in creating a militarized state. A citizen was to be a good soldier, and it effectively excluded women from full citizenship. The territory was divided into 6 military divisions, and all generals were automatically members of the Council of State. The 1805 document made no provision for any kind of legislative council to limit the power of the emperor, who was entitled to make laws, collect taxes, command the armed forces, and name his own successor. It was also completely silent about the civil and political rights of the people. In separate regulations, Dessalines continued the system of forced labor that Toussaint Louverture had created. That's the Haitian flag that was adopted. So the long struggle that had begun in August 1791 had finally culminated in the creation of an independent black ruled state. In 1805, however, the future of Haiti remained uncertain. The dictatorial government Dessalines had created depended on the loyalty of the army and the unity of its commanders, many of whom had been enemies at earlier points in their careers. The conflict of interest between a rural black population eager to pursue their own interests and to manage their own lives, and a governing elite that still dreamed of restoring the profitable plantation system for their own benefit, remained a critical problem. And of course, things didn't just end there. There was several uprisings, coups, etc. after this that went on well into the next century. And then later also American intervention in the form of Marines or economic sanctions. But Haiti is still there, and it remains the first Black Republic ever. Thank you. That's the end.